Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at some of the settings and the structure for your Apache web server installation. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, client-side scripting, and server-side scripting. Now, in this video, we are going to focus only on some configuration for your Apache web server. This video assumes that you've got a Windows installation on the Apache web server on your Windows installation, not as part of a stack or in a Linux virtual machine or anything along those lines. But again, the process is going to be pretty similar. And I've actually got some videos on how to configure your Apache web server for Linux that I'll try to remember to link in the description of this video. But on this example, we're going to focus in on the settings files and the structure for a Windows installation, beginning with my location for my Apache web server. You'll notice that it's in C software and Apache 24, and that just happens to be the particular Apache web server that I'm running. And what we're interested in is we're interested in a couple of folders, really. I'm just going to take a second to point them out. The bin folder, of course, is where you launch your Apache daemon, the executable. There's my httpd.exe. You'll also notice there's a conf folder. In some of the earlier documentation, I had mentioned this. This is actually, we're going to spend a little bit of our time in this video. And then there's, for instance, an error folder and a logs folder. And then, of course, the one that we have already seen in the previous video, and that is our ht docs. So what you want to do is sort of make a mental note of the structure of this folder. And then what we're going to do is we're going to jump into this configuration folder, and specifically we're going to take a look at the httpd.conf file. Now I'm going to open this up in Visual Studio. There's nothing magic about that. You can use Notepad or whatever tool that you find to be your favorite. But what we're going to do is we're just going to point out, I guess you could say, sort of a little bit of a high-level view of this configuration file. We're not going to go into every single setting, but basically this is the file that gets read when you launch your HTTPD daemon, or whether you have it set up as a service or you're just simply running it from the command line. This is the file that it's going to be looking for. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll notice right off the bat, you'll see that where it defines the server root. And you'll notice that that corresponds to the installation folder for Apache 24. Now, what happens in this configuration file is that basically you're leveraging sort of a combination of hard-coded paths, variable values, and in some cases, relative paths. But you'll notice, for instance, that we have this server root variable, and we're going to use that in just a second, a little bit further down here in the file. But the key to note here is that we have our base installation directory, in this case, of C software Apache 24. Now, if you scroll down a little further, this is another example of something we've covered in some of the earlier documentation. And this is just simply the port that you're listening on with your Apache web server. In this case, we're going to leave it alone as port 80. You can set it up to listen out of a specific IP address, out of a different port. Again, it doesn't really matter too much as long as you know what you're doing. And that's worth playing around with a little bit. Try to switch to an alternate port, stop, and then restart your web server daemon. Important to note here is that you do need to stop and start the daemon every time you make changes to this configuration file. This configuration file is only read on startup. Now, you'll notice here below this that we've got a whole bunch of load modules. Now, I'm not going to go into any of these really. I might point out a couple. For instance, you've got your CGI module, and then a little later on, you'll see that I also have this one set up to handle PHP. You'll notice that I have, for instance, my path to my PHP DLL. Handled that again in some earlier documentation. But these are all the modules that get loaded in addition to any of the base modules associated with your Apache web server. In other words, you want to add some additional functionality to your web server, whether it's some sort of C binary or, in this case, PHP support. This is how you would go about turning on and off these particular modules. And you can see also that I have my PHP initiation file, or the init file. The location to it is also in my C software folder. Hopefully you start to get I guess, a general feeling why I like to use C software. It's just a convenient one-stop shopping location for all of your development tools. Now, as we go down a little bit further, again, there's quite a few settings that we can change. We're not going to be worried too much about most of these for right now, but I do want to point out, for instance, the reuse of that srv root variable. And you can see here that that is how you define your document root. And the subfolder then that in this case that we're going to dump all of the files that are related to one of our websites is going to be our HT docs. Now, again, you can structure this differently. You can use different paths. You can change the permissions. And if you were doing a production server, you probably would want to do that. And we're not really going to cover this in any of our videos unless we get a chance to really look at security. We're just basically going to be treating this as a development server that is only going to be accessed with the local host address. Now, if we scroll down a little bit further, then you'll see that there is one other configuration setting that is important to us, and we are going to go ahead and change this, and this is sort of in conjunction with the PHP support that we ultimately want to have, and that is what happens when you attempt to connect to your web server in essentially the default directory. In the earlier video, you'll notice that if I had my web server up and running and I just simply went to localhost, that it dumped you in a directory. And I tell you what we can do is we can just pull this up one more time and you can see that basically what it did is it showed me what appeared to be directory contents. And that's probably not what you want to do with a production or even a development web server. And in another video, I'll show you how to set up your index.html. But I do want to take just a second to point out where that folder actually is so that you can get some sort of understanding of the relationship. Again, there's my htdocs folder, there's my subfolder. And now if you go back here to the configuration file, you'll notice that that sort of now starts to make sense. The earlier variable pointed you to the subfolder htdocs. And now what we want to do is we want to see what happens when the user goes to that location. What file is it automatically going to launch? And so right now what we have is we have it set up to automatically launch our index.html, or rather serve our index.html. And you'll notice that if I go back to the folder, well, there isn't one. And for this video, there won't be one. We'll handle that in a later video. Instead, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some additional support here. In other words, I'm going to go ahead and sort of future-proof this server. In other words, I know that I also want to be able to handle index.php, again, because we've got both HTML and PHP support that we ultimately want to have. What you want to do is go ahead and save this file. You want to come out here to your command window. You want to stop your web server. Again, that might just take a second, and then you want to restart that web server, and it's going to reread that initialization or that configuration file. Again, going a little bit further along here, you'll see there are my error logs. And again, it's pointing to the logs subfolder. There's the error.log specifically. And again, what we can do is we could bounce over here to our file system. We can go up to the root of our Apache 24 subfolder and we go into our logs. And if we try to drag and drop this into Visual Studio, you'll notice that this particular log file is locked by your Apache daemon. Instead, what we probably want to do is just simply open this with Notepad and take a quick look at this. We'll drag this over here. And there we go. You'll see there's the logging of our Apache web server. In this case, any errors that might have happened when you start it up, if a folder is missing, and so on. So again, some useful information for troubleshooting will be found in these logs folder, including an access log, an install log, and so on. And then if we continue down just a little further, although we're not going to work too much with it, you'll see that there is where we would invoke any of our CGI libraries, as well as if we were interested in any other support such as SSL. Now, again, we're not going to be doing SSL configuration in this video, definitely, and in later videos, perhaps if we get a chance to, but that is what's going to enable our ability to have our HTTPS protocol also supported. For right now, all we're going to be interested in is HTTP. Again, this is more for development server, not so much for production, but again, this is supposed to get us sort of a good start on how to go about using your Apache web server. So hopefully this video helps out a little bit. Again, remember in the configuration files are going to be in your conf folder. The error logs and so on are going to be in your logs folder. And then more importantly, the one that we're really going to be interested in right now is the files that are going to be placed in your htdocs folder. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize this. It depends a little bit on what version of Apache Web Server you're running, what your operating system is going to be. The default location may be a little bit different. So again, consider those in when you're making the changes to this configuration file. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.